think we're going to get started now. So I want to start off by thanking everyone for coming today on behalf of Americans for Democracy and Human Rights in Bahrain, and on behalf of the co-sponsors of our event today, including Amnesty International, the Bahrain Center for Human Rights, the Bahrain Institute for Human Rights, Civicus, FIDH, Human Rights Watch, and Reporters Without Borders. So welcome everyone to our event on closing civil society space, civil society, religious, and political space in Bahrain, here at the 33rd session of the Human Rights Council. I'm glad to see everyone attending here. I just want to start off just a quick rule off the bat that we're going to only have accredited press doing the video and photos for the event here. So thank you all for obliging us with that. And so I also just wanted to, just before we get started, I'm sitting up here, was sort of struck noting that the last time that we were having a event in this room, we also had a pretty strong representation from Bahraini civil society sitting in the room here with us, human rights defenders and activists from on the ground who had traveled from Bahrain to be here with us. But unfortunately, this session, there's been pretty blanket travel bans issued against civil society and any sort of voices critical of the government. And so, unfortunately, I'm sort of seeing a lack of a number of faces that we're used to seeing here at the council from the independent civil society side. And so I just wanted to start with that sort of observation. Just to quickly introduce my co-panelists here. To my right, we have Said Yusuf Al-Mahafda from the Bahrain Center for Human Rights joining us here from Berlin. We have Ariel Plutkin from the Amnesty International's Bahrain team based in London. And on my left here, we have Layla Matar from Human Rights Watch here in Geneva, and Dwight Bashir from the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom in Washington, D.C. And so, to sort of frame our event, we're gathered here to talk about a lot of the growing human rights crisis in Bahrain, and how it particularly focuses around closing space in terms of civil society in Bahrain, religious freedom in Bahrain, as well as then political discourse and opposition in Bahrain as well, and just closing space for sort of any sort of critical view of what's going on in the country right now. And so, particularly since the last session of the Human Rights Council and over the summer, we've seen a stark escalation of events on the ground in Bahrain, particularly targeting a lot of human rights defenders, human rights activists. As I said, we have blanket travel bans restricting people from coming to engage with the Human Rights Council. This session, we had blanket human rights or blanket travel bans issued against people traveling from Bahrain last session, both as forms of reprisals against the council and people trying to engage with these mechanisms. And so that is always of particular concern. But then also we've seen a number of, we've seen political opposition targeted in the country, and a widespread 5 different UN human rights mandates recently stated was a persecution of Bahrain's Shia. And so, taking note of the recent concern raised by these different mandates, as well as then hearing from the High Commissioner yesterday a number of strong and very concerning comments regarding the situation in Bahrain. But these are, of course, not the first concerning statements that we've heard from UN experts, from the Human Rights Council, from various political and international bodies. And in fact, so today, ADHRB is releasing a new report, which is available outside the room here. And this is called Collective Efforts, and it deals with assessing the past joint statements that have been made here in the Human Rights Council, the different areas of concern that have been raised by a collection of governments over the past several years since 2011 and 2012. And then it also assesses past European Parliament resolutions, there's been, I believe, 9 different European Parliament urgency resolutions that are raising concern on various issues in Bahrain, and you can see those assessed in our new report as well. And then a final section that deals with concerns raised by the High Commissioner for Human Rights, the Secretary General, and other representatives of OHCHR. And so we've sort of taken this opportunity to gather those different statements together into one place, assess what the concerns were that were raised by these different bodies, and assessing sort of any sort of progress that's been made and resulting from those statements. And I think that really what we're coming out with at the end of that is while certain areas of pressure have been successful in the past, we have also seen a strong deterioration in the country that certainly we believe requires increased response from the international community as well. And so with that, we are going to be moving on to our panelists. So we're going to start hearing today from, turning to my right, Said Yusuf Al-Mahafda from the Bahrain Center for Human Rights. He formerly was working with Bahrain Human Rights BCHR's documentation team on the ground in Bahrain, working to document human rights abuses there, working with them from 2009 until 2013 on the ground until he was forced to leave the country. He's now based in Berlin. He's a vice president of BCHR and now working primarily with bringing that message here to the international community and working on bringing BCHR's documentation to an international stage. So I will turn it over to Said Yusuf for your remarks.
Yes. Hello, everybody, and I'm happy to be here and with you all. In the beginning, I would like to thank ADHRB for inviting me to speak at this important event to raise the human rights situation and deterioration in human rights in Bahrain. And of course, as my colleague Michael said, that we are also missing our colleagues. We are missing Nabil Rajab, the president of Bahrain Center for Human Rights, who's in jail for tweets. We are missing other BCHR members. We are missing, in fact, the entire Bahraini delegation, who none of them were allowed to travel to Geneva. All of them had a travel ban. In the beginning, I would like to give you an overview of the human rights situation in Bahrain and the incidents that we have witnessed through the past month. So since June 2016, the Bahrain Authority have taken a serious repressive action in order to punish decent and constrain basic human rights of anyone who disagree with the government. We have not seen such a rapid increase in human rights violation since the pro-democracy movement in 2011. The right of freedom of expression, assembly, association, and religion in Bahrain have become undermined and disrespected so severely that I wonder why the Bahraini government has not yet openly re-announced the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that it has signed. The authorities have targeted almost all groups of the society, not only human rights defenders, activists, political figure, but also religious leader, civil society member, or ordinary internet user have fallen victim into restriction, intimidation, surveillance, prosecution, and arbitrary arrest by the government. The restriction affect every part of the society. During the last month, the government has arrested and harassed prominent public and well-known figures, including BCHR President Nabil Rajab, human rights defender Maytham al-Sheikh, journalist Naziha Saeed, for their activism and speaking up about human rights violation. Besides, since 2012, at least 40 internet users has been convicted for exercising their right to freedom, to free expression online. And also last month we have released a report about digital rights in Bahrain, and we have documented the restriction on internet and also mainly about what happened, especially in Duraz village, which there is restriction on internet there. In addition, also since June 2016, the Bahrain Authority have imprisoned travel bans on at least 23 persons, including the entire Bahraini delegation to HRC, just before they intended to travel to Geneva. This time, not a single BCHR staff member from Bahrain was allowed to leave the country to come here. The government obviously want to prevent that BCHR and others can do their work and advocacy work in cooperation with the Human Rights Council, and this is unacceptable and in a clear violation of the UN mechanism. It's understandable that the government particularly target BCHR because our ground reporting of the events of the summer are essential for other NGOs, media and international community to know what's going on in Bahrain, as we are still able to document arbitrary arrest, protest marches and political sentence from inside the country on a regular basis. Other observers have been silenced or made to leave. For example, in 2016 alone, we have documented that 1,001 persons were arbitrarily arrested, 194 of them children. In total, there are now almost 4,000 prisoners in Bahrain. So the message is clear. The government want to regulate and adjust people's opinion, telling them what to do and most importantly, what not to do. And if you don't follow that, you end up in a prison. Sectarian persecution against the Shia community in Bahrain is still continuing, which is in fact the majority of the people. On 20 June 2016, the government announced the revocation of citizenship of the Shia spiritual leader, Sheikh Isa Qasim. Since then, over 50 senior Shia clerics have been summoned or interrogated by the authorities. In most cases, they were charged with illegal gathering or illegal assembly, preaching without a permit, and inciting hateness against the government. In late July 2016, the trial of Sheikh Isa Qasim and other clerics began. In reaction to Sheikh Isa Qasim's citizenship revocation, and when news spread out that the authorities are planning to deport him, thousands of his supporters gathered outside his home in the village of Duraz to stage a still ongoing peaceful sit-in to protest this decision by the king. The government responds with the full blockade of the village. Entrance into Duraz are blocked and are the only remaining entry points. Security forces check anyone who tries to pass. Only Duraz residents are allowed to enter the village. Non-residents are not allowed to enter the area. Internet and mobile service remain cut off during the night in attempt to restrict the flow of information among the protesters. Bahraini authorities so far has summoned about 100 of these protesters. They detained the majority of them overnight before presenting them to the public prosecution over charges of participating in illegal assembly. The ones who have been released were forced to sign up a pledge that they will not participate again in the protest. The government, however, is not only circulating public opposition, also political ones suffer from a major blowback. On June 14, 2016, Bahrain Authority closed the largest political opposition group, Al-Wafaq Society, the same Faith / Al-Risala Islamic Society, and the Islamic Electment Society, the two remaining Shia Muslim civil society organizations in Bahrain. To conclude, the intense repression in Bahrain proves that the government not only ignoring its own commitment to address human rights situation, but even worsening the situation within the past 3 months since the last session of the Human Rights Council took place. Finally, we urge the Human Rights Council to issue a resolution in order to establish a monitoring mission in Bahrain. The Council should further call on to the Bahraini government to comply with cooperation agreements with the OHCHR and the Council, to recommend its international obligation to immediately release all prisoners of conscience, and to guarantee the fundamental rights of free expression, assembly, religion, and association without any reprisal. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Said Youssef, for those great remarks there, and for the perspective of BCHR from on the ground and what's going on, and bringing that message, even though so many of your colleagues are not able to be here with us today. So just moving on down the line here, we're going to, I'll pass things off to Ariel Plutkin, who's from Amnesty International, and if I may, she's the campaigner from the Bahrain, on Bahrain from the Middle East and North Africa program at Amnesty International's Secretariat. She's been working on Bahrain for over 3 years now. And for part of those 3 years, she's also done some work on Iraq for Amnesty International as well. And so Ariel is a great part of Amnesty's Bahrain team in London. So I'm going to hand it over to you.
And thanks specifically to Michael and ADHRB. So Amnesty International is deeply alarmed by what we've seen in the past few months. Of course, human rights abuses is not new to Bahrain. Since 2011, we've seen torture, we've seen killings of protesters, we've seen the use of birdshot against protesters and the use of tear gas, we've seen multiple unfair trials, the use of death penalty, and no accountability for human rights abuses, both from 2011 and up until today. But what we've seen in the past few months is a real escalation of the Bahraini authorities' clampdown on human rights to a level we really haven't seen since 2011. In particular, we've seen the clampdown on the rights to freedom of expression, association, assembly, and movement. We've seen the targeting of human rights defenders and civil society more widely, and as Michael said, the civil society from Bahrain cannot be here today because of travel bans. We've seen the targeting of political opponents and the opposition and religious figures, and this was through a sequence of repressive events, which I'll elaborate on today. In terms of the repression of the opposition, for Amnesty International, this has been unprecedented. The recent repression has been unprecedented. In May this year, Sheikh Ali Salman, the Secretary General of Al-Wafaq, the main opposition group in Bahrain, had his prison sentence more than doubled for peaceful speeches he made critical of the government. His sentence was increased from 4 years to 9 years. Following this, in June, we saw the spiritual leader of Al-Wafaq, Sheikh Isa Qasim, have his nationality arbitrarily stripped. He's since also been put on trial on charges relating to money laundering in relation to the receipt of khums, which is a religious obligation for Shia Muslims to donate a fifth of their yearly profits to their spiritual leader, who receives the money and distributes it to the poor. And this has been conducted in Bahrain for centuries amongst the Shia community. In protest of Sheikh Isa Qasim's nationality stripping, hundreds have taken to the streets outside his home in the village of Daraz and staged a protest. And since then, we've seen a continuous sit-in, peaceful sit-in. The authorities have reacted by closing all roads to Daraz except for 2, where they've set up checkpoints. And at these checkpoints, anyone who doesn't have ID showing that they're residents of Daraz are not allowed in. And this includes people who don't intend to protest and who only want to visit their family in Daraz. So in addition to the restrictions on movement in Daraz, we've also seen scores of protesters, and as Said Youssef mentioned, at least 60 Shia clerics have been summoned and or arrested because of their participation in the sit-in. The majority have been charged with illegal gathering, and 4 clerics have since been sentenced to between 1 and 2 years in prison. And currently 9 remain in detention and are facing trial. Others, like Sheikh Maitham Al Salman, who is also a human rights defender, was arrested, denied access to a lawyer, and charged with illegal gathering and then later released. We're still not sure whether he will be facing trial or not, but the threat remains over him. These arrests and prison sentences appear to be a tactic used by the Bahraini authorities to intimidate peaceful opponents, and in particular Shia clerics. In July, in a shocking move, Al Wafaq was dissolved and had all of its assets seized following an order by the Court of Appeal. This was after the Ministry of Justice had filed a lawsuit against the political opposition. And this is not the first lawsuit that the Ministry of Justice had filed, but this is the first time that Al Wafaq has been dissolved. The Bahraini authorities presented no credible evidence to show that Al Wafaq is anything but a peaceful opposition movement, and Amnesty International considers Al Wafaq's dissolution to be a violation of the right to freedom of expression and association of its members. The Bahraini authorities have also intensified their clampdown on human rights defenders and civil society more generally since June. The rearrest of prominent human rights defender Nabil Rajab, who is also, as Said Youssef said, the president of BCHR, on the first day of the previous Human Rights Council session, was a sign definitely for Amnesty International and for the international community that the authorities had decided that human rights defenders had no place in Bahrain. He is currently detained and facing trial for making and reposting peaceful comments on Twitter relating to allegations of torture in jail prison in March 2015 and in relation to the war in Yemen. As many of you will know, Nabil Rajab has been in and out of prison since 2012 because of his human rights work and has been subjected to a travel ban since November 2014. Amnesty International considers Nabil Rajab a prisoner of conscience and calls for his immediate and unconditional release. 24 other individuals, in addition to Nabil, have either received official travel bans or been prevented from travelling to participate in human rights advocacy visits, including here to the Human Rights Council session in June and in this current session. Of course, targeting human rights defenders and political activists and restricting freedoms of expression, assembly and association is not something new in Bahrain. To give just a few examples, there continues to be a ban on protest in the capital Manama, and prisoners of conscience who've been in prison since 2011, since the uprising, including Dr. Ali Al-Ekri and 11 of the 13 opposition activists, including Abdul Hadi Al-Khawaja, Hassan Jawad, Hassan Mashaima, Dr. Abdul Jalil Al-Singas, remain behind bars. There's also the continued imprisonment of the leader of another opposition party, of Al-Wahdawi, Fadl Abbas Mahdi Mohammed, who's serving 5 years for his party's criticism of the Saudi Arabian-led airstrikes in Yemen. These are all prisoners of conscience, and we reiterate that they must be released. Other repressive measures which have been taken by the authorities to silence critics is the stripping of nationality. We've documented that to date 316 people have, since 2011, including human rights defenders and former members of parliament, have had their nationality revoked arbitrarily. Stripping citizens of their nationality without adequate due process protections is arbitrary and in violation of Bahrain's human rights obligations. The majority of the 316, including Sheikh Issa Qasim, were effectively rendered stateless, as they have no other nationality. Those who've remained in Bahrain are in limbo. They have no access to a bank account, access to social services, and they are at risk of any moment being expelled from Bahrain and from their family. At least 6 have been forcibly expelled so far, and this includes human rights lawyer Taimur Karimi and university lecturer Masoud Jahromi, and 2 Shia clerics. What is deeply worrying now is the extent to which the authorities have gone to either ensure that these people are not able or are scared to speak out. Whether through travel bans, imprisonment, or the threat of losing their only nationality or being forced to leave their country and their family behind, the once thriving and courageous civil society in Bahrain, who's been engaging with the international community for many, many years, is at real risk of disappearing. Human rights defenders and political opponents are either behind bars, prevented from travelling outside of Bahrain, or indeed they've chosen now to self-censor. Others are living abroad, having claimed asylum there because of the high risk of arrest, or they've been forcibly expelled from the country. And with international NGOs and special rapporteurs effectively not being allowed to visit Bahrain, it's critical now more than ever for the international community to take a stand, give Bahrain civil society a voice on the international stage, and publicly call on Bahrain to immediately end this crackdown. And the first steps that they should take are releasing all prisoners of conscience, lifting all travel bans, reinstating the nationalities of those who had it stripped, and allow those forcibly expelled to return. And of course, the dissolution of Al-Wafaq must be annulled. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ariel. Moving along to my far left now, we have Dr. Dwight Bashir, who is the co-director for policy and research at the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. While at USCIRF, Dr. Bashir has led or participated in numerous fact-finding missions internationally and has traveled widely throughout the Middle East, Africa, and Europe. He serves as an expert on international religious freedom and the plight of religious minorities in the Middle East, in the training of officials at the U.S. State Department or U.S. Departments of State and Homeland Security, and is serving his second two-year term for the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum Committee on Holocaust Denial and State-Sponsored Anti-Semitism. Dr. Bashir has been interviewed by a number of regional and international media outlets, and he lectures frequently in the United States and globally on various issues of international affairs, including countering religious extremism, ethnic and sectarian conflict, peace and security, and freedom of religion or belief in the Middle East and North Africa. And so, with that, also, I would mention that Dr. Bashir also was recently in Bahrain, and so can hopefully then be able to share some of his very recent insight into the developments there. And so,
much, Michael, and for the invitation to participate today. You know, it comes at I think, a difficult time, frankly. The commission I work for in the United States is an advisory body to the President of the United States and the Secretary of State in the United States Congress, a unique entity independent from the executive or legislative branches, but we make recommendations. We travel abroad engaging foreign government officials and civil society groups. And as Michael mentioned, I was recently in Bahrain. I've been traveling to Bahrain just about every year since 2009, before the protests in 2011 and the so-called Arab Spring. And I think what was most troubling for me this last visit, just a little over a month ago, was the fact that I got very few government meetings while in country. This, to me, is an indication that the government is not as willing to engage on issues, is not as willing to respond to some of what is happening in the country. As was mentioned, we've documented, have information on more than 65 cases of Shiite clerics who have either been interrogated, arrested, charged, or sentenced on a variety of spurious charges, from illegal gathering, peaceful protest, inciting or instigating hatred. And so I think I just wanted to step back for a second to give a sense of what I see from the unique vantage point of freedom of religion or belief, because our entity uses the international human rights standards, Article 18 of ICCPR, and Article 18 of the Declaration of Human Rights as the basis for assessing and evaluating freedom of religion or belief in countries globally. Bahrain has been a country which has a lot of good things to show as well, as far as religious freedom is concerned, for its small non-Muslim minority population. It's one of the only countries in the Arab world that has recognized faiths outside of people of the book, Christianity, Islam, or Judaism, and that is they recognize a Hindu community in Bahrain. Most of the other Arab countries have no recognition of any faiths outside of the three quote-unquote monotheistic religions. So this is a positive, and there's a rich tradition and history here of that. But what I want to say is that when you're talking about a majority population that has faced systematic discrimination and since June a sharp increase of interrogations and arrests, you're starting to get to a situation where the response can no longer be that these are individuals who are violating the law, who are political activists. For a long time there was this gray area of what is going on in Bahrain. These are opposition groups asking for more political space, or is there a religious component? You can appreciate that some in Bahrain, particularly with some government officials I've talked to over the years, will cite the role of Iran in Bahrain in terms of interference in affairs in the country. And when you look at an opposition group like Al-Wafaq, pointing to the fact that its leadership are clerics, similar to the concept of the guardianship of the jurists, which is unique to Iran, where the clerics, the supreme cleric, is on top and everything else is below, as one of the justifications, really, of why there's concern here. But I just want to point out that from all the years I've been going to Bahrain, and those who study this much closer can appreciate that the system in Bahrain is far from what you would see in Iran. In fact, and I think why this is important is because there's an increase from what I see of citing the role of Iran and saying that one of the reasons for the crackdown on clerics in Bahrain is because of the concern that there's increasing ties with Iran, and the clerics travel to Qom in Iran. And this is not just religious training, there's political training and this very nefarious activity. Nothing has been produced to justify that. And I think it's important to stress that the kind of Shiite tradition that comes out of Iran that governs the country is very different from the majority Shiite practice in Bahrain, which is much more aligned with the quietist approach, for those who are familiar with that, not this guardianship of the jurist approach. So, and there's different religious leaders in Iraq that are revered much more than in Iran. So I think that's an important point, because this is a justification, and laws are being applied to crack down on the illegal gathering, the peaceful protests, the incitement laws on this basis. And this has to be understood in the context of Bahrain, and why some of these allegations are, in fact, not only inaccurate, but outright false. And so I think it's important to appreciate the climate we're facing. And, stepping back from religious freedom for a moment, I think what we've seen is, and I think we'll see this in our last presentation, kind of tying things together, but what I wanted to comment on is the fact that when you shut down the largest opposition group, which Al-Wafaq, operating all of these years, and the dialogue process is in effect not only frozen but completely shut down, you leave no opening for or hope for some kind of progress going forward. And why I say this is because over about a 7-year period, what I've seen is an increase of the extremes of segments of the population in Bahrain, and that goes to both the majority Shia population as well as the minority Sunni populations, who, in effect, either you align more with the government line, or the opposition. And frankly, opposition has become a very gray area now, because when you don't have much leadership, the population doesn't really have a group to rally around. I think it's fractured, if anything, and maybe that's what the goal and intention is here. But what I would say is that I think unless there's some mechanism to engage between the government and civil society and opposition groups, the concern is that things are only going to deteriorate further in the near term, and that when you're talking about the various human rights, and now I think freedom of religion or belief is being assaulted in a way that we have not seen, frankly, even since the early days of 2011, when more than 30 mosques, Shiite mosques and religious structures were demolished by government forces and government entities. The government has indeed, to cite something in terms of progress, has rebuilt about 27 of the 30 that were identified in the BICI report, those mosques. I visited most of these sites. There are 3 sites that are still, there hasn't been any progress, even though the government says it's completed the process. It's not yet complete, and there's some sites that are, historic, that have not been, that were built on areas, in different areas, and so this is a significant point. We had recommended that the government reimburse the Shiite community for a number of mosques, about 7 that were rebuilt by the community, because the government had said it would rebuild these, but that has not happened, and what they've done is simply issued permits for those mosques and done some of the legal work and saying that's going to be their contribution. So this is unfortunate, because this would have been a goodwill gesture that I think would have gone a long way to the community. But I think the point is that when you go to the heart of people's faith and their personal belief, and that is something that clearly ends up under assault, and then you go after the leadership, this is a concern, because let me just cite 2 cases as 2 different kinds of examples, and it has been referenced earlier. The Sheikh Isa Qasim case, you can debate, what the charges are, how legitimate they are or not, but my take from the community, having just been in Bahrain, is that if there is a conviction on money laundering for this religious obligation of the contributions for homes, this is going to be seen as a direct attack on the majority population. And my concern here is, if there is a conviction, we could get to a state that we haven't seen in recent years in terms of the country, because there are entities who are waiting to have some kind of reason to do some things that we haven't seen. And you can just imagine what I'm referring to without saying it explicitly, because of the fact when you go after religious or spiritual leadership, this gets to the heart of people's fundamental rights. In many ways, freedom of religion is cited as kind of one of the fundamental, or almost the first freedom, because this is a personal freedom and a public freedom at the same time. It's a private and public, and both are protected under international standards. And so when you get to going after the leadership, when you are going after people who are trying to pray in areas that were designated as mosques and religious structures and being interrogated, or you shut down a very important celebration, the Ashura celebrations in October in certain parts of the country, and you disperse people from celebrating this, this gets to the heart of how you can escalate. So I think I will conclude by suggesting that there needs to be a mechanism reinserted, and I would encourage the international community to look very closely. And I think there's no coincidence that the High Commissioner for Human Rights mentioned Bahrain in his opening statement. I only wish he went further to talk about freedom of religion or belief, not just freedom of expression or association or assembly, because just last month, several, as was referenced, several rapporteurs, in effect, came together, and it's important that we understand that freedom of religion or belief, when you get to this area, you get to you expand in terms of the crackdown, and the reason our commission has not recommended Bahrain for a more kind of serious, a country that would be considered a country of particular concern, which under the U.S. Statute means there could be sanctions, because of the fact that from our vantage point it had not gotten to the religious freedom area as much as larger human rights and the political. So when you get into these areas, you risk, I think, further escalation. So I think this is a real opportunity because I think a year from now we could be in a situation where the escalation could get to a point of no return, and we certainly don't want to see that in a region where sectarianism is being stoked on, I think, both sides of Bahrain. So I'll leave it right there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dwight. And certainly, thank you for that very stark assessment of your most recent visit to Bahrain, and certainly a number of trends that you've seen over time. I think hearing, particularly at this last, how serious things have gotten, on the ground, and sort of assessing that. I think now looking to Geneva and what's going on here. I think I'm happy to hand this over now to Layla Matar from Human Rights Watch here in Geneva. Just briefly, Layla is the UN advocate at Human Rights Watch's office here in Geneva, where she's responsible for advocacy work at the Human Rights Council and other UN mechanisms. Layla was previously UN advocacy representative for the Cairo Institute for Human Rights Studies, conducting advocacy work on civil and political rights in the Middle East and North Africa region at the UN in Geneva and at the African Commission for Human and People's Rights. She has trained human rights defenders from throughout the Middle East and North Africa on advocacy. Before coming to HRW, Layla worked as a global campaigner with Avaz, designing online campaigns on global and national issues. She also has a very extensive educational background, including at Harvard University and McGill University as well. And so happy to turn things over to Layla from here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael, for the introduction, and thank you to my fellow panelists for, I think, having painted a accurately grim picture of the human rights situation on the ground in Bahrain. So as Michael suggested, I will be placing this discussion briefly within the context of the international community and the Human Rights Council specifically. For those of you who have been following Bahrain, you will know that member and observer states of the Human Rights Council have come together on 5 occasions to deliver a joint statement addressing the situation of human rights in Bahrain, and that these statements were delivered by Switzerland at 2 occasions on behalf of a group of 47 states. And for those of us who follow the Council closely, we know that that is actually quite a big group of states that have come together to express concern collectively at the Council. Those statements we also observed over time. The last one was delivered a year ago, in September 2015, but we saw that over time these statements became increasingly strong in terms of their condemnation of the human rights situation in Bahrain, and also that they became less and less congratulatory because there were fewer steps or progress made that could be welcomed in these statements, and I think that is worth noting. Unfortunately, however, we have now for a year not seen any joint statements on Bahrain or any other type of collective action at the Human Rights Council to address the situation in Bahrain. And I believe it's no coincidence that in this year, where there's been a lack of international scrutiny and a lack of scrutiny by the UN's main body for human rights, that we have seen the deterioration in the situation that has been described by my fellow panelists. And I don't need to repeat the violations we've heard about against human rights defenders, opposition, and Shia clerics. But I do want to point out that, especially in the past few months, leading up to the previous session of the Human Rights Council, and then also leading up to this session, there were particular events that took place. And again, I wonder if that is a coincidence that right before Human Rights Council sessions start, or during Human Rights Council sessions, we see these type of violations. So, for example, some of the violations pointed out occurred during the Human Rights Council session in June. Nabil Rajab, of course, was arrested on the day of the opening session of the Human Rights Council, but the morning before, 5 defenders were prevented from coming to the Human Rights Council, and they had also participated recently in an OHCHR workshop on the ground in Bahrain, specifically addressing cooperation with the Human Rights Council and its mechanisms. So again, no coincidence that this took place, as well as the dissolution of Al-Wifaq and also the arbitrary revocation of citizenship for their religious leader also took place during the June session. And I point this out to say that that indicates to me that Bahrain feels increasingly emboldened and brazen, given that they feel they can carry out these acts while the Human Rights Council is in session. And of course, leading up to this session as well, we saw that the head of international relations for BCHR was prevented from coming to participate. And I'll get back to the issue of reprisals, which is what I think these acts constitute a little bit later. But what I want to express here is I think it's clear that the Bahraini government is picking off its political opposition one by one, as well as its defenders. And Human Rights Watch's research supports that this pattern is part of a strategy to silence opponents and intimidate others from speaking out. And all of this is taking place within the context of relative silence now for the past year from the international community, including by the Human Rights Council, and that's what makes these type of violations possible. The government of Bahrain has attempted here at the Human Rights Council, but also elsewhere, to sell a narrative of improvement, a narrative of change. And the lack of action by the Human Rights Council would signal to Bahrain that this narrative is actually being bought. But what the actions of Bahrain on the ground reveal is that the government actually has an aversion to any meaningful reform on the ground. And I think one fact that attests to that is that 4 years after, well, actually almost 5 years after the report of the Bahrain International Commission of Inquiry came out with specific recommendations for progress in Bahrain, on some of the most substantive areas of reform, little to no progress has been made. Now, this situation hasn't gone unnoticed, not by the Council up until a year ago, but also not by experts of the Human Rights Council. We've seen that in the Secretary General's report on reprisals, which is issued once a year, Bahrain has been featured very prominently, featuring in almost every report, including the one last year, where the case of Nabil Rajab was taken up. Now, I checked this morning, and the reprisals report for 2016 has not come out, as far as I know, but I would be very surprised, given the acts of reprisals that I've described and the panelists have described, if Bahrain was not included again. And of course, as Michael has mentioned, the special procedures have individually and collectively come together to express concern about the situation of freedom of association and assembly, freedom of expression, arbitrary arrest, and also freedom of religion and belief. Additionally, the High Commissioner, as we know, has spoken out several times, including yesterday, when he urged action on Bahrain, or more accurately, he said that this is a situation that needs further attention and greater attention than what we are seeing now. And I concur with that. The Council should have acted on Bahrain yesterday. It must act on Bahrain now. Bahrain's violations currently politically carry no real cost, not even a reputational cost at the Human Rights Council. And Bahrain has in some ways become the perfect example of selectivity, or a perfect manifestation of selectivity at the Human Rights Council. And unfortunately, the Human Rights Council does continue to be plagued by these dynamics where certain countries and their allies are able to shield themselves from scrutiny at the Human Rights Council. And instead of addressing Bahrain on its merits as it should, instead we've seen that there's been not only a lack of attention but also a decreased attention, and that perceived security interests and economic interests are, in this case, as with many others, trumping human rights considerations. I believe that Bahrain needs to know that there is a cost to its human rights violations, but also that Bahrain's civil society on the ground needs to hear that the urgency they are facing is being reflected in the foreign policies of countries that claim to place human rights at the heart of their bilateral relations. Human Rights Watch calls on states to individually and collectively address the human rights situation in Bahrain at the Human Rights Council. The joint statements that we saw were good, they were strong, they were increasingly strong, and they indicated that the situation would continue to be on the radar of states. But now there has been a silence, and there needs to be continuity and follow-up at this session and moving forward. I want to also briefly place this within a discussion that's taking place at the Human Rights Council on the occasion of the 10th anniversary of the Human Rights Council, where there's been a proposal by civil society that there should be objective criteria for assessing country situations on their merits. Some of these criteria include experts of the Human Rights Council sounding the alarm and calling for action. It includes, of course, the facts on the ground and an expert assessment of the situation on the ground. And I urge everyone to consider if the Human Rights Council was in fact a place where human rights situations were consistently addressed based on their merits, would there not have been already a resolution on Bahrain? Finally, I want to speak briefly to the fact that we have seen time and time again that repression and support for repression is not a long-term strategy for stability, and nor is it that in Bahrain. As we've heard, street protests have dwindled significantly since November 2014 in Bahrain, although, as we've also heard, there has been some recent peaceful protest incidents. But the reason that we're seeing fewer people in the streets is not for progress that has occurred in Bahrain, and it is certainly not because grievances have been reduced. It's because the government's brutal crackdown has left most leading activists and organizers either incarcerated or exiled. Our analysis is that the population on the ground is increasingly frustrated, and as has been pointed out, there is no political outlet for this frustration. I want to tie this to what the High Commissioner pointed out in his remarks on Bahrain yesterday. He reminded us that the past decade has demonstrated repeatedly and with punishing clarity exactly how disastrous the outcomes can be when a government attempts to smash the voices of its people instead of serving them. We believe that the Human Rights Council needs to take steps to contribute towards incentives for the Bahraini government to choose a different strategy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Leila, for those for that insight here into bringing this discussion into the context of Geneva. So with that, that's for all of the panelists' remarks. We'll soon be turning it over to some questions and answers from the audience. I would ask a few things of anyone who wants to ask a question. I would ask that everyone sort of who's a long statement from the floor. So if you can just ask a question, be pretty direct with it so that we can turn it back over to the panelists and we can continue the conversation here. I would appreciate that. If we do call on you to ask a question, please identify who you are and what your affiliation is. And so I think we're going to take just a couple of quick groups of questions while we do this. But before I start asking for questions from the audience, I want to sort of take my prerogative here as moderator to pose a question or two to the panel myself, just that sort of came to me during each of your different remarks. And so I from a number of our different panels here, we heard about a lot of different actions that have been taken, abuses that have been perpetuated on the ground, and abusing different rights that we've seen. And I sort of want to explore a little bit, or ask if you can share some insight into, is there a legal basis in Bahrain that the government seems to be using in order to target a lot of either the religious figures or opposition figures or human rights defenders, and so that's my first question that I'd like to pose back to the panel. Also, from Ariel in your remarks, I noted that where you had sort of mentioned where there was once a very vibrant civil society in Bahrain, and that space is now closing. I know that for a long time Bahrain has been this example of an example in the region to point to say that this is where civil society exists in the Gulf, and this is the sort of the most vibrant example to point to. And I would ask, is Bahrain still that good example to point to in the region, or do we see that its once prominent position there as that example, is that decreased? And I know that we've sort of touched a little bit on these issues. So Dwight, from your remarks, we heard about, you'd mentioned sort of an increase of extremism sort of in both ways because of a lot of these attacks on, or targeting of religious communities, and just seeing a greater polarization. And I guess I would want to explore a little bit our question, both to you and the panel, if we do see any sort of what would be a way forward, what would be a path. Is there any sort of area that you see that there is potential for reversing this trend, either from our own perspective here, as non-governmental people up here, or what can, and then extending that into sort of Layla's remarks, what are different areas that the international community can recommend to Bahrain to build on any sort of space for reversing these trends that we've seen. And then finally, then in Layla's remarks, you've sort of noted that Bahrain has been more increasingly emboldened or embrazened in its approach to the council. And I wonder if you got any insight as why we may think that we've seen them then increasing. I know we've sort of talked a little bit about that there's been a lack of collective response this year, but is there anything else, even in a broader perspective, of seeing Bahrain taking advantage of a little bit more space and moving forward? So with that, I would like to turn some of those questions back over to the panel here before opening it up to the floor.
Thanks, Michael. In terms of your question on civil society, yes, it's not a positive outlook in terms of the activism that the civil society in Bahrain have been able to do for many years. The authorities have diversified the way in which they've targeted civil society and the ways that they can silence them. So we've seen the travel bans. We've now seen stripping of nationality. This is a risk that many human rights defenders in Bahrain have to decide whether they want to take that risk or not. And ultimately, it's a personal choice, of course. Is it still a good example in the Gulf region in terms of active civil society? I would still say yes, but they've had to adjust the ways that their activism, their advocacy work. Now that they're not allowed to come to go abroad and to come to the Human Rights Council sessions, we'll have to see what the civil society decides to do there. But of course, there is many Bahrainis outside of Bahrain now who've now taken up that role to really advocate for human rights in Bahrain, including Syed Yusuf and many others that I can also see in the room. So while the Bahraini authorities have been trying to silence critics within Bahrain, you will see outside of Bahrain the voices getting stronger. And in fact, this might be to the advantage of Bahrain's human rights in terms of the voices that's heard outside of Bahrain. So the international community being able to speak to these people directly because they've either been expelled from Bahrain or they've chosen to move outside of Bahrain for reasons I mentioned before.
Sure. When talking about interrogations or detentions, arrests of people for, peaceful protesting or assembly, they cite the Law 32 of 2006, Amendment Law 18 of 1973, Article 2. Offenders breaching public security or public order during an authorized procession by causing harm to individuals or public and private property shall be held accountable. And then the carrying of weapons during a procession is not permitted, including firearms, etc., all the way down to solid sticks and sharp tools. So, a lot of times you find this being applied when there's some kind of, the burning of tires, which you've heard about in some villages by young people, and then this law is applied. People are charged and convicted under this law. So this is something you see over and over again. But, I think on the larger question of, why the extremes and what do you do about it, well, at some point, you have to have desire and an interest to come to some kind of understanding. And from what I've seen since 2011, this has ebbed and flowed, where there has been some genuine desire on opposition and government sides to move forward, and then one side has either moved back. The government, of course, cites the boycotting of the elections as a major impediment towards progress, and I think has had actually some reprisals, as was referenced earlier, on that basis alone, of not participating in the 2014 elections. Say, well, if you're not going to participate, then you're not going to be part of the process. Sure enough, 2 years later, the largest opposition group is dissolved. So I think there's a correlation there, which is something that doesn't get as much attention, but I hear it from the narrative. The other concern is the narrative is growing inside the country, but externally. I see personally as a concern when you have the roles of Saudi Arabia and Iran, to be very clear, on both sides, using as propaganda through Arabic language from the Iranian side and Farsi on the Saudi side, which is a fascinating thing that I would like to see some analysis done, because you see Iran has upped its Arabic language propaganda in advocating for Shiite clerics in Bahrain, which I had not seen before. So at some point, what this does is this stokes the sectarian flames that we've seen in the region so much, and at some point, this feeds into that narrative, which is not going to be conducive for dialogue and reconciliation, unless you get pressure, as I think Layla mentioned, from governments, interested governments, including the United States, the United Kingdom, EU member states, and others, and the region, frankly, as well, neighbors, until you have some kind of genuine effort here to encourage this process, that it's in their interest. Because if you don't see this as in the interest of the government of Bahrain, and if they're becoming more strident in their response to the council or to other governments, frankly, the Secretary of State, John Kerry, made a strong statement in late July, just the week before I was in Bahrain, and the government officials were publicly, attacking. And pro-government media attacking this statement, and that's not new. I mean, so if people are concerned that there's, growing, response to the Human Rights Council, the President of the United States, other high officials have been assailed by Bahraini government officials for years. This is not a new phenomenon, so don't be concerned. Most governments respond like that when they're being criticized or abuses are being pointed out. So I think unless there's a genuine will from member states here to come together and realize that this could spin out of control, and I'm not trying to embellish or sensationalize, because at some point you have to look at the early warnings, and I see the narratives, I hear it, and these are missed often in terms of we've seen a number of cases. If you don't listen closely to some of the elements that were no fans of sectarianism, and all of a sudden they're buying into that narrative, that's one of the first signs that, okay, we see no path forward, let's resort to other means. And so this is my, concern going forward.
The political impasse where the opposition is fearful of participating in political processes and have no faith in them. And on the other side, it's really the hardliners within the government that are empowered, and they very much see the quest for rights and freedoms within Bahrain from either a security or a sectarian perspective. And that's really what needs to shift. And for that to shift, yes, statements at the Human Rights Council, yes, statements by public officials are very much needed, but what is needed above that also is a willingness by powerful states, including the United States, to rethink their security arrangement and their security approach and assistance to Bahrain. Very briefly on Michael's question on, well, how do we know that they're feeling emboldened? Well, besides the correlation, admittedly, of events happening during HRC 32 in June, showing that Bahrain currently is not fearful of the Human Rights Council. I would add to that also that we know that Bahrain does care about what the Human Rights Council has to say. We know that because they've gone to great lengths to prevent the Human Rights Council from saying what it has occasionally said. And I think that that in itself shows that it does matter to Bahrain, and that if there were more bold statements coming out of the Human Rights Council, that could be a contributing factor to changing the dynamics.
That's going to be put on by the Bahrain Human Rights Observatory, as well as some other partners. That'll be on the 15th from 4 to 5 p.m. And so that will be moderated by Mohammed Sarkal, with speakers Said Yusuf al-Mahafdo appearing there as well, Jawad Fayrouz, and then via Skype from Bahrain, Nadal Al-Salman, as well as also via Skype, Ms. Erin Kilbride. So just to put that out for further discussion on some of these other elements that were raised here today. So with that, again, if you ask a question, please identify who you are and who you're with, and please asking questions as opposed to statements is what we'd ask. So are there any questions at this point? That
resources, the staffing, the office, they have everything at their hands really to provide real accountability for Bahrain. But what we've been seeing is that there's been no real accountability. So collectively, there's no accountability. If we look at them specifically, if we take, for example, the Ombudsman of the Ministry of Interior, they say that they are investigating human rights violations, including torture and ill treatment, including lack of medical access for prisoners in Jau prison and Dry Dock prison. But on the ground, we still hear that this hasn't changed anything. Many prisoners still face have a lack of adequate medical access. They still haven't seen the Ombudsman's investigations on their torture allegations or their ill treatment allegations reach the courts, or if they've been referred to the Special Investigations Unit. We've seen very few security officers within the Ministry of Interior being prosecuted, and if they are prosecuted, they receive very lenient sentences. And then you can compare this to the life imprisonment of prisoners of conscience of Abdul Hadi al-Khawaja and others, and you can see the harshness taken against these political prisoners compared to the leniency given to the security officials. So in our assessment, there's been no real accountability, and therefore this technical assistance package we haven't yet seen progress made because of this new assistance from the UK.
What's going on in Bahrain? Still, Bahrain Center for Human Rights received a lot of allegation and claims of torture in Bahrain, and our members have interviewed many victims of torture and received many serious allegation of torture in Bahrain. And that is it's becoming kind of systematic in Bahrain. Before 2010, Human Rights Watch issued a report about the torture and the systematic torture in Bahrain, and until now the torture is still ongoing in Bahrain. On a day, all those who were arrested for political charges, we received a claim and allegation of torture in Bahrain. And also a very recent case that we are very concerned, the case of Isa al-Haiki. Also there is allegation of torture. He was, according to the testimony, killed under torture in Bahrain. But what's happened about even the Special Investigation Unit, that they closed the case where they say there is lack of evidence. So we are very concerned that this institution where their role is to bring justice, to hold accountable those responsible, they always close the cases. And this is very recent. And they have closed many cases of extrajudicial killing and torture. They close the cases and they don't refer it to the court, which is in our understanding that the continuation of torture and the widespread violation is because of culture of impunity. The culture of impunity is the main reason which lead to the grave human rights violation in Bahrain. And also, for example, the other prisoner of conscience in the CID building, and then the king promoter and she get a position in the public prosecution, which this is kind of a smart step for the king, is to give her another impunity, bring her in the public prosecution. And also there are many other examples where the king is promoting those responsible of violation and giving them more other position which give them impunity in the judiciary system, in public prosecution, instead of holding them accountable in a fair trial matched to international standard. And also the last point, also the judiciary system in Bahrain is also one of the main problem, that also they don't investigate in many torture claim and many extrajudicial killing, and it's been a tool by the government and by the king to oppress the opposition, to give impunity to those responsible of violation, and only sentencing those who are peacefully exercising their view in Bahrain. And the recent example is Nabil Rajab, who is for retweet and tweet. He could be sentenced to 15 years. We are very concerned. Next month, 5th of October, he could be sentenced to 15 years for tweet or retweet. And those who are torture or extrajudicial killing are enjoying impunity in Bahrain.
Mandated by law to make recommendations on countries that are the most severe violators of freedom of religion or belief globally. And his question is, why has Bahrain not, is it time to elevate them? The top tier is called countries of particular concern, where I mentioned that economic sanctions could be a repercussion if they are named by the U.S. government. Then there's a tier 2, and then there's other countries monitored, in effect a tier 3, where Bahrain has been. The fact is the statute requires very detailed requirements to be on this list. In effect, systematic, ongoing, egregious violations, and those violations are defined as killings, torture, disappearances, or prolonged detention without charge, on the basis of religion or belief. So one of the difficulty in Bahrain for some time has been the fact that you're talking about other human rights, and there's this, freedom of expression versus freedom of religion. I mean, this whole concept has been a massive debate on, say, so-called blasphemy, anti-blasphemy laws globally that say, well, this is a freedom of expression case, not freedom of religion. We see this as where there's kind of an intertwining. But in the case of Bahrain, I think with the targeting of clerics, it enters in a whole new realm, because it's no longer, I mean, this is not Ali Salman, the head of Al-Wafaq, an opposition political group. These are religious clerics who are not involved in the political dealings. So now, when you see this sharp increase, particularly since June, and by the way, our reporting period is from, in effect, March 1st to the end of February. So our report that came out May 1st went through February. We'll have our annual report come out by May 1st of each year. So a lot of these activities that would get in the realm of systematic abuses, targeting clerics for the sake of who they are, is in this new reporting cycle. So you could definitely see some changes in terms of the way USURF approaches Bahrain, I think, going forward.
Carl, I'm the UN coordinator for Salam for Democracy and the UN representative for Jusur Youth Organization. My question is about the youth in particular. Last time we heard a case of Mustafa Mutagawi, who is 16 years old. He's still in prison, been acquitted. My question is, how many other youth or children that are still in Bahrain prison? Thank you.
From ADHRB. So we spoke about how there's been a lack of action in the council for the escalation of repression in Bahrain. What do you think it would take for the council to act? And is that something we should still be looking towards, or are there other kind of avenues of action that like the international community could take, like NGOs or anything? I think we spoke a little bit about this, but if you could just speak a bit more on it, that would be great. Thank you.
The half year of 2016 only, I will not speak the last 4 years, but at least Bahrain Center for Human Rights documented only this year from January until June 129 children were arrested in Bahrain between the period January and 2016, January and June 2016, and we are seeing still these targeting children is continuing in Bahrain. And also the most concern that I just said recently about the torture, still we are receiving a lot of allegation of children being tortured in the CID building, which is the investigation department.
So is this children under 15 or over 15? And are they under 15 years old, juvenile, or they are over 15 years old?
So it's kind of mixed. Some of them less than 15 and more than 15.
Briefly to add to what we'd already discussed, I think that the challenge, of course, when it comes to the question of, well, what more can be done, is that ultimately it is a question of political will and the extent to which countries are willing to place the human rights facts over their perceived interests. And I emphasize perceived because I think that a vibrant civil society and a functioning democracy, if that were to take place in Bahrain, would be in the interests both of the region and internationally. I think what I would urge civil society around the world to do is to pressure their own governments to be willing to take a more principled stance when it comes to Bahrain. I think international and regional NGOs have spoken in unison about what they think should take place at the Human Rights Council and elsewhere, most recently in a letter signed by a very wide range of NGOs urging the Human Rights Council to take action. I think that what could make a difference is if local NGOs in key capitals around the world pressure their government and hold them accountable to their foreign policy commitments.
Thank you so much for that, both Leila and Said Youssef. I guess we have just a couple minutes left. Does anyone else have any final closing thoughts that they'd like to express? Yes, no? All right. So I guess with that, I would just like to close by just noting just a few last things of just observations from the discussion thus far. Really hearing about the situation and the risks that human rights defenders take. I think that Ariel and Said Youssef had expressed. These are really impressive, and I just have to comment that in the beginning this by noting those who aren't here, who are a lot of the human rights defenders who are now facing consequences and are under travel ban and are unable to be here as they've been in the past. They do take a lot of risks, and I'm constantly impressed by a lot of the human rights defenders and the human rights community I see in Bahrain that we have the pleasure of working with. And it's not just risks of coming abroad, but even risks of tweeting and retweeting in your own home that can result in, as we said, even up to 15 years in prison for Nabil Rajab. In looking at the religious persecution, of course, Sheikh Isa Qasim, the head of the leading spiritual leader of the Bahrain Shia community, so I believe his next trial date is tomorrow. So again, a case to continue to keep watching from the international community. And just a final note that, hearing about all of the deteriorating situation, the escalation, but also the concern of where things may still go to if things continue on this trend, and looking at the role of the Human Rights Council. The Human Rights Council is supposed to be sort of, taking note of those early warning signs and being a preventative body, and that, waiting until situations deteriorate to the point that they are in Syria or in Yemen or something like that to be able to raise the concern of the council. This mechanism really is envisioned to be able to deal with situations before they reach that bad of a point, and that's something that I would like to note and would certainly like to I would hope that the international community here in Geneva will choose to bring their attention back to Bahrain and to raise their concerns in further collective efforts to address the situation in Bahrain. And so with that as well, we have more of our new reports available outside the door. Thank you all for coming, and thank you all for joining us in this conversation today.